This is part 1 of a series of discussions surrounding the general logic of the Quran, but more specifically, focusing on linguistic nuances, and to a greater degree, the metaphysical and metalinguistic system underlying its grammar, its largely misunderstood use of pronouns, and the cosmological presuppositions that lay at the foundation of the whole corpus. In considering all these facets, our inquiry primarily aims to answer one thing. Why does God refer to himself as he and not she? Which I consider to be the ultimate question for reasons which will become clear. This is a question that has eluded many scholars and even grammarians of Arabic, biblical and Jewish scholars included, and the answers are, from what I've found, largely vague and aren't really direct. The reason behind this can be attributed to an overall narrow understanding of language. That is, it's widely taken for granted. We're deficient as regards its nature and principles. We have language, but not a perspective of language. We don't have a perspective of it such as to see it for what it is. To borrow an analogy by Aristotle concerning the notion of wisdom, with a little tweak, the master artist is wiser than the mechanical worker, because the former handles the thing, whereas the latter is handled by it. The artist has such a mastery over his craft by virtue of having understood and internalized its most essential principles and causes, so as to be able to teach it and freely apply it. The mechanical worker, the inferior of the two, is mastered over by the craft, and can do no more than replicate, mechanically, the specific dictates and demands of the craft. In this sense, the craftsman doesn't see his craft, he's drilled by it. He's automated by it. The master artist is distinguished by a sense of detachment and freedom with which he interacts with his craft, because he's able to see it for what it is. He's, in a sense, its equal. It neither oppresses him or automates him as it does the worker, nor does he by incompetence and misapplication. A passage by Borges brilliantly captures this, as he says, through his character, "Let me explain. In order to truly see a thing, one must understand it. An armchair implies the human body, its joints and members. Scissors, the act of cutting. What can be told from a lamp or an automobile? The savage cannot really perceive the missionary's Bible. The passenger does not see the same ship's rigging as the crew. If we truly saw the universe, perhaps we would understand it." We ourselves experience something of the artist's finesse when, for example, we pick up a new language. Pick up as in learn to speak it fluently. We agree that fluency is a stage at which we're no longer burdened by the strict rules of grammar that weigh us down in the beginning of the learning process. We instinctively not to use a suffix here and a prefix there. We know what words and conditions come with what grammatical cases, what solecisms and errors to avoid, though we may not even recognize them to be cases with rules. Somehow we intuitively know that. We may begin to think or even dream in that language. And the most telling sign of all, we have such a grip on it so as to deliberately and for what we may call experimental purposes, break those same rules, to modify and inflict words that commonly permit of no such operations, to use adverbs in place of nouns or adjectives to stand for verbs. Only an artist can construct an artifice. A seeming grammatical error, when perpetrated by a master, carries a significant import. His apparent mistake is often an artifice, a sign of genius or ingenuity, so we give him a chance. A statement that he's not burdened by the loss, like the worker, but feels particularly free to expand and refigure them, to push the boundaries, so to speak, but not in a way that compromises the core principles, but to render malleable and anti-fragile the parameters of linguistic use, to give expression to the inexpressible. And it's thanks to artisans of language that we have such a largesse of useful idioms and phrases to use. Another example which reflects the worker's dilemma is his lack of creativity. He can't adapt and apply himself to specific changing circumstances. He's rigid and formulaic. He only knows how to do something in the way he was shown, or the way that he's used to. We ourselves show this when, remember how in school examinations, say in a math test, we're struck by how different and almost unrecognizably new the questions are from the original material. This proves the point. A very capable lawyer and judge can see in any case the specific legal nuances and ambiguities to which the average person's eyes would be totally blind. So is a doctor and a diagnostician, a chess master or an architect. English literary figure Thomas de Quincey calls this casuistry, which he defines as the science of cases, or those special varieties which are forever changing in the face of actions as contemplated in general rules. The tendency of such variations is, in all states of complex civilization, to absolute infinity. Analogous to the worker's dilemma, as it concerns the more philosophical dimension of language, is the fact that we're so accustomed to identifying things by their concrete qualities. We take the words by which we normally signify for the things to which we assume them to refer, with no rhyme or reason. A certain animal is called a dog because that's what people call it. In this sense, language is replete with elements of naive realism, so much so that it amazes us that such a question as why an animal is called a dog is even asked. Isn't it the point, one may ask in objection, that language should simply denote and refer to things, and that the meaning is known and recognized by its speakers? True, but not to the philologist, the historian, the scholar whose office requires them to be fussy and ask exactly those types of questions. I mean, had we been content with the scholastic and medieval language of physics, of passion and action being the inherent qualities of objects, no quantum physics, no mechanics, no electricity, no radio would have been founded. At the same time, those same medieval codes were a step above the much vaguer ones that came before them. The problem that language has suffered from hasn't really changed. And to crack it is to crack not just language-related problems, but perhaps the mind itself. To recall Borges' passage, we may put it this way. We think language, as I am using it here, is human. When it's asked, if even, how exactly is language rational, or what are its origins, and seeing that it's a philosophical question, and that it applies to any and all language speakers, it goes to show that the domain which language covers is much vaster than can be inferred from its formulaic use. It's almost as though we have a duty towards this question, an onus, that we're being drawn to some fundamental unifying source. Common answers that we find online, or by academic linguists and researchers, do no more than reflect the philosophical and cosmological views to which the majority of us today subscribe, and are thus limited by them.
1 neuron, you're alive. 2 neurons, you're moving.
They range from the attempt to downplay the essential rationality of language by overemphasizing experience and inheritance as the primary factor of language acquisition, to flat out downplaying the rationality of experience itself so as to avoid the question altogether. Today's reigning paradigm, Darwinian cosmology, which insists on putting man above all other species, is forced to reckon language in the way that we use it as exclusively human, as an evolutionary advantage and adaptation which we have over other species, as an ideal which lower animals, as it calls them, are approaching but may never attain.
To begin, how to start.
It's catch-22, as immediately as the above sense of duty attached to the question gives the incentive for a renewed attempt to crack the puzzle of language, the effort is promptly limited, in its onset, to and by the Procrustean presuppositions we hold about language, causing us to fall back on the generalization offered by our highest ontological and cosmogonic principle, which is Darwinian cosmology, which is really a plot device, a deus ex machina that's whipped out in cases like this when an intellectual impasse is encountered at the highest level, and unless our ontology is reevaluated, unless we question and challenge the validity of this principle, no progress is possible. Which is where the Quran becomes so important, as it was precisely sent to deal with intellectual stalemate such as our modern time is struggling with, and when the question is pursued by way of the Quran, we find that it stresses that it's not exclusively human, any more than it is any other particular species. We find that it's bigger than to be exclusive to this or that species. The Quran inverts this naive relation of dominance by offering wonders of language use in the animal kingdom. Examples that directly challenge the idea that language, at least in its complex grammatic form, is unique to human beings. Take the example of the ant that alerted her colony to seek shelter so as to avoid being crushed by Solomon's army. We see that the ant had constructed a complex sentence by stringing together a logically interlinked sequence of words and syllables. Or take the hoopoe who gave Solomon a rather erudite debriefing on the goings-ons and internal affair of the kingdom of Sheba, involving a synoptic, as it were, breakdown of the central ethos and Weltanschauung of an entire society, which couldn't have been derived by simply observing the daily habits of its people, but only by a penetrating philosophical insight. In addition to other examples of animals and other supposedly non-sentient life forms, like mountains, the earth, and the clouds, being the recipients of divine commands that, as we see, are essentially linguistic since they're of a dialectical nature, and any such relation is fundamentally linguistic. Some may object to the linguistic nature of these commands, or at least accept it to the extent that his commands were mediated by a language, but a language that is exclusive to its recipient. As when he ordered the earth to swallow the water left from Noah's flood, he did so in a language that only the earth can understand. Or when he sent the crow to show Adam's son how to bury his brother, that he did so only in a language which crows or birds can understand. But the truth of the matter is, it's one and the same language. The same language with which he commanded the angels to yield themselves to Adam, with which he called out to Moses in the valley, with which he framed the very Quran, with which he creates. This has to be the case since what spawns from these commands are acts whose scope and range of impact implicate a vast agglomeration of life forms. The command which the earth carries out, for instance, is an act which implicates all that which inhabits it, necessarily. The whole infinite matrix of symbiotically related species have their source in one all-encompassing, superordinating, logical linguistic formula, primordially drawn by God. And the species that share that must also interact through and share the linguistic principles with which the formula was written. Much like how a chemical formula is a cipher detailing how one substance may affect or be affected by another. The cipher can of course be expanded and modified to account for specific circumstantial changes, hence imbibing the motif of linguistic diversity and versatility, and thus presumes that there is a basis, a fundamental formula, that contains all formulae. In this sense, all substances and life forms whatsoever are, ab initio, causally connected, affected by one another, and draw their very mode of being and identity from that. And the possibility of such a connection must, in precedence, be algorithmic, which is to say, linguistic. And this is what's meant when we say universal language. If we're able to point out and predict, as we so aptly do in chemistry and physics, how one thing may affect another, it's because we have a prior linguistic affinity to them, and not that we're outsiders computing or calculating them indirectly. And any progress in the applied sciences is no more than the continued acquaintance and discovery of that foundational fact, whose theological analog is the so-called logos.